Hi, I'm Dominique Alhambra, and I'm the Anthropology Collections Manager at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science.
Hi, I'm Michelle Coons. I'm curator of archaeology, and today we're here in the Anthropology collections.
So if you've been to the museum and you haven't been to an open house, did you know that there are actually 2 sub-basement floors underneath the museum full of collections?
Which is super, super cool. So today we thought we would tell you a little bit about what happens down in this collection space and go and see some of our favorite objects and tell you a little bit about those.
This facility opened in 2014. Before that, Anthropology collections were in several different spaces. So when we opened this building, what we had to do is move all the collections from the old areas down to the new spaces.
And it's been quite an effort. So we've been moving now for going on almost 7 years, but that's because every single object is what we're calling getting the Rolls-Royce treatment. Everything up in the different areas throughout the building was stored in a variety of different ways. When it comes down here, we're making custom boxes for every single object, and then they're getting put away in their beautiful new homes that we're going to show you in a little bit.
So when we make a preservation quality amount for a museum object, that means we make it out of all archival materials. The first thing we do is we measure the piece, the exact size and dimensions of that piece. And then what happens is that we take those measurements and we plug it into a formula that tells us exactly how big to make the box. That's what we have here. The cardboard is a special archival acid-free board called Blue Board. And then what we put inside the box is a mount carved out of an archival foam called polyethylene foam. And we carve the shape to the exact shape of the object.
So what are we looking at here, Dominique?
Yeah, this is a really cool piece. We acquired this in 2019. And it's a skateboard by James Johnson, who is a Tlingit artist.
Okay.
And what we have here is the sun over a human figure. And these are motifs that are really common in Northwest Coast art. And the really cool thing about skateboards is that it just shows the continuity of the Northwest Coast designs. We have very, very old objects up to these new items that, were made just a few years ago. That just shows that Native peoples are still here and alive today and creating and using these designs even now.
Yeah, that's really cool.
So what happens is we take it and it is custom fit right to the mount and we place it into the handholds. And there you go. Now we can move the object and pick it up without having to touch it.
And let's go check out where we put it. Okay, well, so here we are in the collection space. And this is really a state-of-the-art facility. It actually won some awards for sustainability from LEEDs. It is climate controlled. You can see everything is white. A lot of this is for pest management so that we can identify if things are there. In our collection in Anthropology, we have 60,000 records, so about 30,000 of them belong to our ethnology collection. And if you think of anthropology, it's the study of people. Ethnology is more recent objects. Then we have our archaeology collections, which are people of the past. And so that also numbers about 30,000 or so records. But if you count every single little tiny piece of stone, and objects like little beads, it's well over 1 million objects in this collection.
You might be wondering, what are all these handles on the ends of these rows? So this is actually what we call a movable carriage. And this handle lets us crank it from side to side. That way, in this movable storage system, you can put more carriages and save space. So what we do is we gently crank it over. This is our textile storage system. So what we do is all the really big textiles that can't fit flat in a box, we roll them up. And that's to avoid creating folds and creases on the object, because that's where the damage starts, right? When you fold something over a really, really long period of time, the fibers start to break, and then it's irreversibly damaged. So by rolling them, it avoids all those creases, and it keeps that object safe. So what you see here is rows and rows of really, really long textiles.
Now let's look at some collections. I'm standing here in front of a cabinet that has a whole bunch of ceramics from the Tiwanaku culture, which is a culture that lived in highland Bolivia. And this particular materials dates really from about around the year 800 to around the year 1100. Pretty much everything we have here are ceramics, though we do have some metal objects, including this little pin here, which would have been used to keep a like a shawl closed. But I would love to show you one of my favorite ceramic pieces. So this here is a carro, and carros were used in political negotiations. Oftentimes they were found in pairs, and a ruler would have a set of them, or some kind of political leader, and you would have some kind of a toast with either maybe an enemy or someone you were doing some business with. They were pretty much always, we expect, to have been filled with chicha, which is a corn beer, very popular throughout the Andes. This one is really quite beautiful. You can see here there are some really gorgeous designs of felines and condors. Really beautiful designs on the band here. Very high quality, thin clay, high quality slip paints as well. Just a pretty incredible, incredible object that we have here in the collection.
So you might be wondering what this really big crate is doing in the middle of our workshop. As part of the anthropology department, we lend objects from the collections to other museums so that it can appear in exhibits. And that's pretty cool, because we often learn things about our collections that we didn't know before it went on exhibit. So this is one example. This is a beautiful beaded cradle board from the Kiowa people. And it was collected in Oklahoma around 1890. And when Native American art is this old, often people didn't write down who the artists and makers were. This piece was loaned to the Minneapolis Institute of Art for the Hearts of Our People exhibit, which toured the country in 2019 and 2020. The curators of that exhibit were looking for really amazing examples of women's art. In fact, it was the first exhibit to be totally made with just female Native American artists, which is pretty awesome. And this piece, we knew it was Kiowa, but we didn't know who the artist was. And it turned out the descendants of this artist, Tado Atone, when they visited this exhibit, they recognized their great-grandmother's art. And so they came to us asking us where it came from, and we were able to match up that she was the artist for this piece.
So one of the coolest things about working here is that we get to see all the objects as they come down from the various places and into the workshop. And so this is some materials that were just recently moved down here that are waiting for a box so that they can get put away. And it's really neat. I'm looking at some Shipibo Kanibo from the Amazon, little miniature paddles, a little miniature canoe. And this particular object is a miniature manioc press, which is you fill it with the pulp of the cassava or the manioc, and pull it. And this is a very tiny one. Usually they're really, really big, long tubes. And you can squeeze out what are toxins that are inside of that tuber. So pretty cool to be able to just come down and see really interesting objects.
Thanks so much for coming with us on this tour of the anthropology collections.
And if you'd like to come and join us, hopefully we'll be able to start accepting volunteers again soon after, things get a little bit more stable with the COVID situation. And so if you are interested, we're always looking for people to help us build these boxes and get to check out all of the objects that come through the workshop. You can find us on the website under the volunteer tab.
Yep. And let us know if you have any questions or if there's something you're interested in seeing in the collection. And we hope to see you in
Hi, everybody. My name is Memory Williams, and I am a part of the marketing team here. And as always, I am just popping up to share your questions with our presenters. Today we have Dominique and Michelle. So drop those questions in the chat. I am monitoring Facebook. I am monitoring YouTube. So if you're watching on any of those platforms, please feel free to drop your question. And I see we have our first question from one of our top fans, Mina, who asked, "What is the funniest piece in the collection?" I like that question. What's the funniest piece in the collection?
Man, what do you think, Dominique?
Wow, that's a really tough question because there's such a huge variety. There's one sculpture. It's Mexican folk art from the mid 1980s, and it's really interesting because what this person did was they molded and painted clay, and the figures in this piece have really interesting expressions. Like their eyes are huge and they kind of look like they're screaming. But it's a really interesting piece because it is a childbirth scene, and there's a woman and on a bed, and it's a C-section, and these two nurses are pulling the baby out of her body, and that's the scene. And it's really cool.
Wow.
And, yeah, just unusual for sure. But yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. I mean, it's hard sometimes to answer that because I mean, as a curator of archaeology, most of the materials that I tend to deal with are from different cultures around the world, and we don't necessarily know their sense of humor. And so something that we might think is really funny may actually have been really serious, or something that we say, oh, this is ritual, this is really serious, may have just been a big. So yeah, I think it makes it a kind of a hard question to know the intention behind the what the artist meant with the piece. But yeah, there's definitely some really interesting pieces that we do have.
Interesting. So I have a question. So what was the thought behind the pieces you did select for our tour? Was there a certain group you were trying to stay in, or were you covering your favorite pieces in the collections? What was your thought behind that?
I think, well, for archaeology, I just decided to choose some of my pieces that I've worked with. I had a lot of fun thinking about those pieces from the Tiwanaku civilization from Bolivia. So they're some of my go-to artifacts. We wanted to highlight both the ethnology materials and also the archaeology materials. So I think that was some of the reasoning, but I know Dominique, that story Dominique shared is just really incredible and new. And it also really highlights how we are continuing to learn about our collection, and it's an ongoing process, and that it's a very active collection. So yeah.
Yeah, and on my side of things, well, the cradle board in this instance, that loan came back into the building just a couple of days ago. So some of it is, these are the pieces traveling through the workshop. And the cart that Michelle had that was full of South American pieces from the Shipibo and other groups, we have been working on our World Ethnology collections as part of a really generous grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities called NEH Cares. Mm-hmm. they gave us these funds so we could support our staff to move and rehouse this collection. And so some of those pieces, we're still wrapping up the rest of the items in that room, but in the last 6 months, we were able to rehouse over 2,500 objects.
Awesome. Wow, that's amazing. Every time I hear that, I'm just like, wow, there's just so much that goes on in the basement. And when you come to the museum, you don't even see it. It's a lot of that's shown around the museum is just a small portion of what we actually have in our collections. So let me check and see if I have any other questions. Oh, yes, I do. I have one from Melissa who asks, what are some of the most difficult objects to care for in a museum setting? That's a great question.
I'll let Dominique go for that one. As the collections manager, that is bread and butter, right?
For sure. I think some of the difficult objects to care for the collection is we're actually coming up with it, coming through this right now, is that in the past museum practices, sometimes to preserve objects, they would put pesticides on objects so that, you know, bugs and other critters wouldn't come and eat them. Well, the reason that bugs and critters didn't want to eat them is because these pesticides and poisons are also really dangerous for humans. So it's, yeah, we do have a process for testing objects to see if they might be contaminated with heavy metals, and protocols for how we need to handle those objects so that we are not putting ourselves at risk for extra exposure to these dangerous pesticides.
And I wanted to bring this up too with you all mentioning volunteering at the end. It made me think about teen science scholars, and those applications are now open. And I know we have a few positions in entomology and anthropology. Could you tell us a little bit about what they may be doing if there are any teens watching who may want to apply and come and work with you at the museum?
Yeah, sure. We are taking 2 teams in our conservation department, which is a part of anthropology, but it's a whole other workshop space that's right next door, and they're doing incredible work. So once objects come through the anthropology into our workshop, we identify if they need any kind of stabilization, if like there's beads or basketry that's starting to come woven. And so that all gets moved over into conservation. And so the conservators are going to be taking 2 teams to help work on a variety of projects. So really cool. You get to work with different materials. It's a bit of art and chemistry. So it's kind of combining two sides of the brain that don't necessarily always go together. And it's really cool stuff. And then in anthropology, we're taking 6 teams to work specifically with Dr. Erin Baxter on a project on sandals. And they're going to be doing all kinds of fun things with ancient sandals. So yeah, so please apply if any of that sounds of interest.
Interesting. It does to me. And I love teen science scholars because there are times when you have those participants who begin as teen science scholars, and then they become volunteers, and then they start to work here, and then next thing you know, they're here for 20 years. So this is definitely a really good way to get in with this museum. Oh, we're getting some more questions on Facebook. I see Erin left a smiley face. Hello, Erin. Thank you for joining us. We have a question from Diana, who asks, how do you restore something that is approaching 50% of loss? And I know last week we kind of covered some of that. We talked about how do you know when something is not worth restoring, or it's just in such a condition that the cost or the work to restore it may not be worth it. So can we talk about that? Just how do you restore something that's 50% of loss, or is just really, really in bad condition?
I can put it to Dominique, but I know you talked about this last week, but we're not in the business of necessarily restoring anything. We are stabilizing. And so we're not going to like do any of the beadwork. It's just to make sure things don't go any farther. And so we do, as a curator, one of the things that I'm responsible for is to decide if we need to remove something for our collection for any number of reasons, which we call deaccessioning. And this might be because we have multiple of the same thing, or something is completely been destroyed and really doesn't add any scientific or research value. And so we make those decisions then if that's something that we would no longer like to keep in perpetuity or care for a very, very long time, because it's expensive to do that type of stuff. And so it is an object by object, case by case basis that we make those assessments. And it's not very, very common. We're not deaccessioning tons and tons of our collection, but we definitely do at certain points in time. Dominique, I don't know if you wanted to add to anything that.
Yeah. Yes, I would agree that it's not about necessarily restoring an object. It's about preserving it to make sure that it doesn't. All things will fall apart eventually, but we are in the business of stabilizing an object to slow down its deterioration, and restoration is more for or art museums who want to make something pretty for display. And a lot of the techniques that go into that really use those same techniques for our stabilization, but it's all about finding and testing materials that work on the object, and a lot of color matching and blending. So it is a little bit of both art and chemistry.
Interesting. That's a great question, Diana. And we get that a lot about how we care for our collections and specimens and everything like that. So I am not seeing any more questions right now. But if you do think of any later on, just drop them in those comments. I'll come back and look at it. I do not mind sending it to Dominique and Michelle. So how about we go ahead and wrap it up? Any last words about our awesome anthropology collections in our basement? Anything else you want to leave us with?
I guess I will say real quickly after something that you mentioned, Memory, and that is that in any museum that has collections, less than 1% is always on display. It's very, that's quite typical, very common. And so there's all kinds of gems and hidden treasures, so to speak, behind the scenes. And oftentimes, once you know about that, there are ways to get tours and to access those collections. We are doing a lot of work. I mean, COVID makes it a little tricky, but to be accessible, to give people that sneak peek so that they can appreciate and learn from these collections, because that's what they're for. They're for the public. And it just so happens that we have them locked away because we keep them safe. But whatever we can do to bring them out into the public eye is what we love and what we do best.
Awesome.
Yeah, and I would add that I became a collections manager because I wanted to see the things. And the cool thing about my job is that, I mean, we're doing the rehousing and the physical movement of objects, so we get to see everything. I kind of like to describe it as like being a librarian, but it's books, it's for objects.
Interesting.
Yeah, and that's what it is. I work a lot with the computer database where we track all of the collections. I interact with researchers to facilitate access to collections if they're looking for a certain type of object, or they're interested in this site or this group of people, and we have the they're looking for. I provide that access, and then I get to do awesome videos like this one right now, where I'm talking to the public and describing what we do. So it's a really, really cool place to work here at DMNS.
Agreed. These are my favorite times too, where we've done all this work and then we get to go and share with our community and share with our audience. So this is always really great. So thank you two for coming on Science Division Live today. Thank you all for watching. And like always, we'll be right back here next Thursday at 12 with our awesome Science Division. Have a great week, everybody. We'll see you next week.
Thank you.
Thank you.